Chapter 39. They studied the single sheet of paper, frowning as to its possible meaning. There was one word written on it, pueblos, and 6 crosses drawn, each one numbered. Will scratched his head. There was something about the arrangement of 3 of those crosses that looked familiar. "What does pueblos mean?" he asked, more to himself than to Maddie. But she answered, "I think it's Iberian. I just can't place it. Does it mean horseman?" She frowned. Her schooling at Castle Araluen had included a basic study of foreign languages, including Gallican and Iberian. But she hadn't paid a lot of attention to those lessons, or any other lessons she had been taught, for that matter. "The benefit of a classical education," Will muttered. Maddie was still frowning, rubbing her forehead furiously as she strained for the elusive meaning of that word. It wasn't horseman. It was on the tip of her tongue. It was villages, she said triumphantly. Pueblo means village in Iberian. And suddenly, Will knew why the arrangement of 3 of those crosses was familiar. He scrabbled in his inner pocket for Liam's map and spread it out beside the sheet from the intruder's satchel. He took a stick of charcoal from his belt wallet and quickly drew lines connecting the 3 villages of Danvers Crossing, Boyletown, and Esselden on Liam's map. The lines formed a narrow oblique triangle. Then he took the sheet that Maddie had found and connected the first 3 villages marked there. He found himself looking at the same triangle. "These are the villages where children disappeared," he said, leaning back. Maddie pointed to the sheet she had taken from the stranger. "And there are 3 others," she said. Will frowned and drew a line from village number 3, which represented Boyletown, to the farthest village marked on the stranger's chart. The line ran east of northeast. He measured the length with finger and thumb, then compared it to the distance between Esselden and Boyletown, calculating quickly. When Will had visited Castle Treleth, he had obtained a detailed map of the Fife. He took it out now and unfolded it, running his finger in an east-northeast direction until he came to a village that corresponded roughly with the one on the chart Maddie had found in the intruder's satchel. "Willowvale," he said. Maddie craned over his shoulder to see the map. "Why that one? Why not 4 or 5?" she asked. "Because it's number 6, so it's the last one they plan to visit. Maybe they haven't been there yet. It's a day's ride from here," he said thoughtfully. "Or a night's ride," she put in. "After all, we don't know how much time we've got." "In which case, we don't have any time to waste." They retrieved their bows, quivers and cloaks from where they were hidden in the handcart. Maddie went into one of the empty stalls and changed from her patched old dress back into her breeches, shirt and jerkin. She tossed aside the thin-soled sandals she'd been wearing and hauled on her soft leather boots. When she finally donned her cloak once more, she heaved a sigh of satisfaction. It was good to feel like a ranger again. Staying in the shadows, they made their way out of the village. Nobody saw them or challenged them, and once away from the open space of the main street, they settled into a steady jog towards the clearing where they had left their horses. "Will Tug be up to the trip?" she asked as they paused for breath. "After all, you've been riding him all day." "He's a ranger horse," Will replied. "He could keep going for another 2 days if I asked him to." They set off again, reaching the clearing 5 minutes later. Tug and Bumper heard them coming, recognized them, and whinnied a welcome. They quickly saddled the horses and mounted. Then Will touched Tug with his heels and headed out onto the road, Maddie and Bumper close behind them. They settled into a smooth canter, side by side. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of their horses' hooves on the packed earth surface of the road. Behind them, a small cloud of dust rose and drifted in the shafts of moonlight that broke through the trees. Eventually, it settled until there was no sign that they had passed. After half an hour, They slowed the horses and dismounted. They gave them a quick drink of water from the canteens they carried, pouring it into a folding leather bucket. Then they began leading the horses, walking beside them for 10 minutes to let them rest. They would continue this pattern throughout the night, alternately riding at the mile-eating lope the ranger horses were trained to, then walking to rest them. It was easier to talk now that they weren't cantering. "What I don't understand," Maddie said, "is why these people are stealing the children. There have been no ransom demands, and in any event, the parents are poor for the most part and could hardly afford to pay much. So what's the point?" It had been bothering her for some time. One thing Will had taught her was to always look for a reason behind a crime. The question to ask was, who benefits? In this case, she could see no advantage for anyone, unless the stealer and his group were simply doing this for the sake of evil itself. "I don't think the idea is to ransom the children," Will said now. He had been giving the matter considerable thought, and there were several clues now apparent. "I think we're looking at a slave ring." "A slave ring?" Maddie stopped in surprise, and Bumper, caught unawares, lived up to his name and bumped into her. "Think about it," Will said. "You said the man who broke into your room was foreign. He had a chart with an Iberian word on it, and those quattros are an Iberian weapon." "Is that significant?" Maddie asked. "It is, when you consider that there's a very active slave trade in Iberian," Will told her. "And children in their early teens are particularly sought after." "I didn't know the Iberians kept slaves," Maddie said. But then she thought she didn't know much about Iberian and its people anyway. She just had a general vague impression that slavery was a thing of the past on the main continent. They don't. The Iberian king has outlawed the practice. Apparently his religion forbids keeping slaves. But it doesn't say anything about trading in them, so he permits his people to capture slaves and sell them on to others. There's a small but active fleet of slave ships operating out of Magala Harbour in southern Iberian. "Who buys them?" Maddie asked. "Generally, they're sold in the market in Socorro." He looked at her and she returned the gaze blankly. "Have you never studied geography?" he asked her. "What do they teach kids these days?" He paused. The words struck a strange chord of memory in him. He seemed to recall Holt saying something similar to him when he was first apprenticed to his old mentor. He shook his head to clear the thought. It seemed that the older he became, the more words and events began to repeat themselves. "I learned a lot of needlepoint," Maddie said acidly. It had always been a sore point with her that she was told to embroider when what she actually wanted to do was go hunting in the forest. "Remind me to call on you when I rip my shirt," Will said. Then he continued with his lesson on the slave trade. Socorro is a city kingdom on the west coast of Arida. It has a big slave market, one of the biggest on the Aridi continent. Slaves are bought and sold there and transported from there to all corners of the hinterland. "And you think that's what's happening here?" she said. He shrugged. "It makes sense. The stealer, the storyman, and their gang are operating in remote villages, where word of the children's disappearance is unlikely to get out to the wider world. Who knows how many children they've abducted? They pick kids who are mistreated and likely to run away. That deflects attention further. People assume that the kid has finally rebelled against the constant mistreatment and run off." "But how do they know who those kids are?" Maddie asked. Will tapped his finger alongside his nose in a knowing gesture. "That's where the storyman comes in. He visits a town, gains the confidence of the children, and spots a likely candidate. After all, it's a sad fact that you can usually find a badly treated child in most villages. He then frightens the children into silence so they say nothing about the questions he's been asking. He leaves town, and sometime later, the stealer comes in and abducts the child the storyman has singled out for him. The other kids say nothing because they've been told if they do, they'll be the stealer's next target. And the kidnapped child is so petrified by the stealer's terrible reputation, as described by the storyman, that he or she goes along without protest. It's quite an ingenious system when you look at it. That's horrible, Maddie said, thinking over what he'd said. That doesn't make it any less ingenious, Will told her. She turned to look at him. That's what's so horrible about it. So what do you plan to do when we reach Willowvale? I'll find out if the storyman has visited recently, and if there's any child in the village who's badly mistreated by his or her parents. How do you plan to do that? She asked. Will's expression turned bleak. I have my ways, he said. Come on, it's time we got mounted again.